So this is our Ponty reading group. We're continuing our reading of the structure of behavior, picking up from page 120 of the translation. So we're on this sequence of forms or structures in behavior that he's setting out at this point. So we saw the, let me see if I get these terms right, the syncretic form. So yeah, the three forms are the syncretic, the immovable, and the symbolic, and there's a sort of hierarchy in terms of the, I guess in some sense, sophistication, but more precisely, it has to do with the adaptability and sort of separation from a specific context of these different forms of behavior. So the syncretic forms are forms of behavior that are very tightly aligned with a specific environmental situation or some sort of aspect of the environment. And so his example that he gives here is the toad that when you present a worm to the toad, it sort of automatically extends its tongue and tries to capture the worm. And it keeps doing this. So in the experiment that he's describing, there's a sort of a glass wall between the toad and the worm, but the toad just keeps trying to catch the worm no matter how many times it fails because of the wall in between. So this is a sort of syncretic behavior where like and this is in more, I guess, recent ethological studies, this is sometimes called like a releaser. So there's like a this behavior that is released by the perceptual encounter with some certain kind of signal, whether it's like the shape of a worm, or often with many animals, mating behavior is sort of structured in this way, where like if a fish sees the other fish that has a certain marking on it, then it will perform a certain behavior as a mating signal, etc. So yeah, this is the sort of the most automatic kind of behavior, and he said we should sort of restrict our use of the term instinct to this kind of behavior, and it's also the most tied to a specific environmental context. So it's always this behavior is always released or triggered by like a specific perceptual encounter, which can be something quite sort of subtle and complicated. So it's not necessarily a sort of point stimulus, like perception of a red color patch or something. It can be like in the case of the worm, so like a certain contrast between the worm and the background on which the worm is located, with a particular shape, a certain sort of pattern of movement. So it can be more complicated than like a very sort of classical stimulus response type of account, but it's still there's still a tight coupling between the behavioral response and the perceptual encounter that is characteristic of this level or this form of behavior. And then the next sort of level that he describes is the immovable forms. So here, what's different is that the immovable forms have a sort of flexible adaptation to the environment, and this can be extremely sophisticated in certain animals, and depending on what their sort of form of behavior is in relation to a particular aspect of the environment. So like he talks about a few different variations of rats navigating a maze, and so rats, of course, this is like a classic animal psychology sort of style of experiment, but rats are capable of learning how to navigate a maze with, say, food at the end. So they can sort of memorize, a pattern where they have to turn multiple times around different obstacles and so on. And after a few trials, they learn, this is the direction I have to go. This is how I have to navigate the maze. And they're also capable of learning, even like if the maze, if you say change the maze in various ways between trials, they can learn like how to they can sort of figure out, okay, this is the direction I need to go, but this path is blocked, so I have to backtrack and go down this other path instead, or something like that. So it's much more detached from the perceptual, the sort of immediate perceptual encounter with the object, so they can not just sort of see the object and then respond to it, but they can have some kind of, representation of like where they are in relation to the object they're trying to reach, and then what sort of detour they might need to take to get between where they are and that object. So it's like more detached from the immediate perceptual encounter. And I don't think Merleau-Ponty talks about this, but I mentioned last time how this kind of adaptation to the environment can be very subtle and can involve perceptual capacities that certain animals have that we don't have, that allows for these very impressive feats of navigation, for example. So like I talked about pigeons that are capable of hearing infrasound, so sound below the frequency range that humans can hear, which goes down to about 20 hertz. So yeah, pigeons can hear sound around like 5 hertz, which is roughly the range of the sound produced when the wind strikes geographical features like mountain ranges. So a pigeon navigating across the landscape can effectively hear the surrounding geographical features, like there's a mountain to the left, or I don't know, there's a stream below or whatever. Like they can hear using this infrasound sensitivity. They can hear the layout of the landscape around them, and so like they can navigate across long distances in part because they're responding to the infrasound and sort of orienting themselves in relation to these geographical features that they're hearing. So if you compare this to like human navigation, where say like if you wanted to plan a trip across the U.S. or across a large country, thousands of kilometers, you would sort of take out a map and get like an overall picture of the whole trajectory you wanted to take, and then you would sort of zoom in from there and say, okay, if I want to get from point A to point B, I have to take this road and then turn here and so on. But this is kind of a top-down navigation strategy that we tend to use, whereas a pigeon or many other animals will employ a more sort of bottom-up strategy, where they are just responding to the perceptual cues of like, when you hear this infrasound signal, turn 30 degrees north or whatever, and so they're just responding to all the different cues, and they sort of learn the pattern of spatial orientation of geographical features, and that's what they're responding to, as opposed to having like a sort of map in their head that they sort of locate themselves in relation to. So like pigeons, of course, there's the famous homing pigeons where you can release them, hundreds of kilometers away from their nest, and they find their way home. So that like they're capable of these navigation feats that like most humans would not be able to do. If you just picked up a person and blindfolded them and dropped them off in a place hundreds of kilometers away, they wouldn't be able to find their way home without like using a phone or a computer or something. So yeah, these types of immovable forms can bring about like very sophisticated behavior, but at the same time they're sort of they're always engaged with the environment in a way that the symbolic forms that we're going to look at today are not. So again, it's that difference between like the pigeon responding to the infrasound signals and navigating that way versus the human who has a map. And the map has a sort of symbolic representation of like, here's the river, here's the mountain, etc. And you can use the map as like a representation of the landscape that you're trying to navigate. But it's removed from the landscape in the sense that you can take the map with you to a different country. You can upload it on a computer, etc. The map is sort of transportable in a way that the pigeon's grasp of the pattern of infrasound is not transportable. So that's sort of where we are in the development at this point. So we're just going to pick up on the section on symbolic forms now. So yeah, if someone wants to read from page 120, the heading symbolic forms.
I can read. The symbolic forms. In animal behavior, signs always remain signals and never become symbols. A dog which is trained to jump up one chair on command, then to pass from it onto a second chair, will never use, lacking a chair, two stools or a stool and an armchair which are presented to him. The vocal sign does not mediate any reaction to the general signification of the stimuli. This latter use of the sign demands that it cease to be an event or a presage, even more so a, quote, conditioned excitant, quote, and become the proper theme of an activity which is to express it. An activity of this kind is already found in the acquisition of certain motor habits, such as the aptitude to play an instrument or to type. It is known that the connection between such and such a visual stimulus, a note, a letter, and such a partial movement toward this or that note on the keyboard is not essential to the habit. It may happen that trained subjects are incapable of designating separately on the keyboard the key which corresponds to such and such a note or to such and such a letter. The keys are aimed at in behavior only as the transition points of certain motor ensembles corresponding to words or to musical phrases. The habit does not even consist in establishing determined kinetic melodies corresponding to known visual ensembles. A subject who, quote unquote, knows how to type or to play the organ is capable of improvising, that is, of executing kinetic melodies corresponding to words which have never been seen or music which has never been played. One would be tempted to suppose that at least certain elements of the new musical phrase or of the new words correspond to rigid and already acquired sets. But expert subjects are capable of improvising on instruments unknown to them, and the exploration of instruments, which is evidently a preliminary necessity, is too brief to permit a substitution of individual sets. The new correlation of visual stimuli and motor excitations must be mediated by a general principle so as to make immediately possible the execution not of determined phrases or pieces, but of an improvised piece if necessary. And as a matter of fact, the organist inspect the organ part by part. In the space where his hands and feet will play, he, quote unquote, recognizes sectors, direction markings, curves of movement which correspond not to ensembles of definite notes, to expressive values. The adjustment of motor excitations to visual excitations is accomplished by their common participation in certain musical essences. Doubtless the correspondence of such and such a musical sign, such and such a gesture by the player, and of such and such a sound is conventional. Several systems of musical notation are possible, as are several dispositions of the keyboards. But these three ensembles, between which there exist, term for term, only chance correspondences, considered as wholes, communicate internally. The character of the melody, the graphic configuration of the musical text, and the unfolding of the gestures participate in a single structure, have in common a single nucleus of signification. The relation of the expression to the expressed, which is one of simple juxtaposition in the parts, is internal and necessary in the wholes. The expressive value of each of the three ensembles with respect to the two others is not an effect of their frequent association. It is a reason for it. Musical notation would not be a language, and the organ would not be an instrument, if the manner in which one writes and in which one plays a note did not comprise a systematic principle, and did not, as a consequence, include the manner in which one writes and in which one plays the other notes. The true sign represents the signified, not according to an empirical association, but inasmuch as its relation to other signs is the same as the relation of the object signified by it to other objects. It is because of this that we can decipher unknown languages. So to try to understand this in terms of the difference between playing an instrument, which is a symbolic form, and this example of the dog who is given a command to jump on a chair, but the example of the dog doesn't rise to the level of symbolic. It's just a vocal sign following which the dog knows that it has to perform activity which is pretty limited in range and even is completely incapable of improvisation. Whereas in the case of the instrument, the activity which is I guess, comprised of the. I'm not sure exactly how to say this. There's a capacity for improvisation now. I don't fully understand paragraphs.
Yeah, so I think so. A couple of things here that I think are relevant in sort of making this distinction between the immovable forms or this sort of empirical association as he describes it here, and the symbolic on the other hand. So there's an example that Lacan gives somewhere. I can't remember where exactly, but he says like you can sort of train an animal or a person to blink when you say the word blink. You can form this sort of like approximately like the reflex theory sort of describes. You can sort of give a reward when someone blinks when you say blink, or to the dog or whatever. But then if you give the command don't blink, like you can't sort of train an animal through a conditioned reflex type of sort of training regime to respond to a negative command like don't blink. Like once it hears the word blink, it responds to the command, to the empirical association that it's developed. It will blink instead of not blinking as you wanted it to do. So like you can't explain the sort of relationship of of negation, or the logical structure of a negation in terms of this empirical association. And so like that's sort of like a general, I guess, example of what the difference is between these two sort of forms of behavior. But in relation to the like the organist or the typist, I think what he's getting at here is that, yeah, so he mentioned this capacity to improvise, but I think it's not so much. So improvisation here is just a sort of signal or a sign that the capacity that is being described is not something that is made up of these simple empirical associations. Because yeah, so like one sort of account of like how you would learn to type, for example, would be that you sort of like you're, I guess you're picturing like the task that he's picturing here is like you have a manuscript written by hand, and you are a typist who types it up into a typescript. And one explanation of how you learn to do this would be that you have this sort of association where when you see the letter B, you type the B key, and then when you see the letter A, you type the A key, and so on. But yeah, so like clearly, what we do when we type is not like a skilled typist is not looking at each individual letter and then sort of responding to that letter by pressing a certain key. They instead sort of move their hands fluidly to produce whole words or whole phrases. But the sort of where the improvisation thing comes in is that you can present a typist with a new phrase that they've never seen before, and they're still capable of producing it, typing it out. So clearly, they're not learning even an association between like words and sequences of movements, or phrases and sequence of movements. They're sort of responding to the structure of the input, which in this case is the written manuscript, the handwritten manuscript. They're responding to this in a sort of flexible way to produce the movements that bring about the typed form. And this is something I think we talked about this early on. This was one of the points that Chomsky made in his criticism of behaviorism in terms of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior. His famous review of that book was essentially that if you try to explain language use, human verbal behavior, human use of language in terms of these sets of associations, and where like a certain stimulus would bring about a certain response, you sort of leave out the fact that most sentences that we use, or most expressions that we use, are novel expressions that have never been said before. Yet the listener is perfectly capable of understanding even a sentence that they've never heard before. So clearly, what it is to understand a sentence and be capable of responding appropriately is not just learning an association between a sentence and a response. So it's the same idea here: is that what we grasp when we learn how to type or learn how to play an organ is not a sort of one-to-one correspondence of one letter to a particular movement of the hands, or one note on the score to a different movement of the hands on the organ. It's instead a sort of grasp of a structure, in the sense that you sort of where all the letters of the alphabet, how they all fit together on the keyboard, and how to produce sequences of those letters to make up words and phrases. So yeah, and so this is what he goes on to in the next little bit, to talk about how there are these correspondences of structure between, in the case of the organ, the notes on the page on the score, and then the movements of the layout of the keys on the keyboard, and then the musical structure in terms of intervals, up and down intervals, and so on. So like in one sense, it's arbitrary. So you could just as well make a keyboard with the high notes on the right and the low notes, or sorry, the high notes on the left and the low notes on the right. The opposite of what we have. There's no sort of intrinsic reason why you would put the low notes on the left and the high notes on the right. But the sort of structure of the a certain note being in between other notes, for example, is not arbitrary. So yeah, there's like this correlation between the structure of the layout of the keys in space and the musical the intervals and the pattern of notes in the musical space, like sort of abstract space. And that's what makes these different structures sort of expressive of each other. He's sort of using this word "express" as a technical term here. So, like, whenever you have these structures that correspond in this appropriate way, you can say that one structure expresses the other. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. If someone would like to start from the top of 122.
I can read. If all musical texts were lost with the exception of one page concerning which one did not even know that it represented music, it would be noticed that the signs on the page can be distinguished by their position on the staff, by adjoining secondary signs, those which distinguish a white from a black, and by their variable groupings within certain units of space or measures. The internal analysis of the text would determine the external contours and the principal dimensions of the universe which is expressed in it. If by chance another universe than the universe of sound possesses the same characteristics of structure, the text remains ambiguous. But this ambiguity does not prove that the relation of signs to the signified is contingent. On the contrary, it is due to the fact that two possible significations have the same structural properties in common. There must be a structural correspondence between the motor ensembles necessary for playing a piece on two different organs, just as the equations of a physical theory can be expressed in the language of another theory. This structure of structures, which, abstracting from the rhythms, they obviously remain the same for the same piece on all instruments, establishes an intrinsic relation between movements which are not superimposable, is the musical significance of the piece. Thus, genuine aptitudes demand that the stimulus become efficacious by its internal properties of structure, by its immanent signification, and they demand that the response symbolize along with the stimulus. It is this possibility of varied expressions of a same theme, this multiplicity of perspective, which is lacking in animal behavior. It is this which introduces a cognitive conduct and a free conduct. In making possible all substitutions of points of view, it liberates the stimuli from the here and now relations in which my own point of view involves them, and from the functional values which the needs of the species, to find once and for all, assign to them. The sensory-motor a prioris of instinct bind behavior to individual stimulus wholes, and to monotonous kinetic melodies. In the behavior of the chimpanzee, The themes, if not the means, remained fixed by the a priori of the species. With symbolic forms, a conduct appears, which expresses the stimulus for itself, which is open to truth and to the proper value of things, which tends to the adequation of the signifying and the signified, of the intention and that which it intends. Here, behavior no longer has only one signification. It is itself signification.
Yeah, so here, this is actually sort of connected to something else I was reading recently, but it's not really that relevant in general. But there's so when you talk about animal behavior, for example, I don't know, a certain, like, I don't know, a lion's capacity to hunt an antelope. So there's a certain perceptual grasp that the lion has to have. It has to be able to recognize that an antelope is in a certain area. It has to be able to sort of track the antelope as it tries to escape and so on. So there's all these perceptual capacities, but of course, these perceptual capacities are not perfect from the perspective just of like sort of detection of antelopes. You know, there's a sort of evolutionary arms race where antelopes try to hide from lions, and lions try to detect the hidden antelopes. And you know, sometimes the antelope wins out, and sometimes the lion wins out. But from a sort of broader evolutionary so you might say that like it would be better for the lion to have better vision, for example, to be able to see the antelope better, you know, when it's hidden in the grass. But from a sort of broader evolutionary perspective, having better vision would require, say, a different structure of the eyes, or different behavior of the lion in terms of like spending more time, you know, gazing at in the grass and trying to find the antelope. And these have evolutionary or metabolic costs. You know, you have to dedicate more metabolic resources to developing different structures of the eye. You have to dedicate more time to scanning the grass to try to find an antelope, etc. And there's a certain trade-off in terms of, you know, better vision or more time and energy dedicated to looking for antelopes means you know, less time for other things, or more. It just has a cost in some sense, and we can expect that evolutionarily the trade-off between you know, the capacity to detect antelopes and the cost of producing the organs and behavior needed to perform that detection is probably pretty well balanced, in terms of, you know, the lion has like as good vision as it needs to detect antelopes reliably, often enough that it is capable of surviving and reproducing. So in some sense, we can say that, like, from a sort of human perspective, we can say the lion is sort of imperfect in detecting antelopes. But from a broader evolutionary perspective, the perceptual capacities of lions are just sort of doing what they do in terms of contributing to the success of the lion lineage in reproducing itself. And you can't really say that it's not perfect or not, you know, correct or whatever. That's just what it is. Yeah, they're doing their best. It's from an evolutionary perspective, in a sense, that's sort of you know, just trivially true. Like the fact that the lion lineage continues to survive and reproduce just means that the lion antelope detection system is just, you know, performing how it should, even if it, you know, it fails to detect antelope sometimes, and from sort of our perspective, it's like sort of the overall balance of the lion ecosystem is sort of ecologically and evolutionarily optimal in a certain sense. So yeah, you can't say that the lion is like not good enough at antelope detection, or it's making mistakes at antelope detection from an evolutionary perspective. So like when we look at behavior of an animal in terms of the immovable forms, or at that level of behavior, you have to sort of there's no sort of question of accuracy or truth of the perception. All that matters is the behavioral response of the animal adaptive to a situation that allows that animal to feed itself or avoid predators, or in general just to survive and reproduce. That's all that really matters from an evolutionary perspective. So, like, even if the animal, from our perspective, is making mistakes, from an evolutionary perspective, it's not a mistake. It's just the correct amount of energy and time and so on to dedicate towards this perceptual task. But then, from this perspective of symbolic forms that human behavior is characterized by, you can say that you make a mistake. You can say that the stick looks like it's bent when it's underwater, even though it's actually straight, and so on. All the sort of famous examples of perceptual mistakes. So here, it's only when you start introducing symbolic forms that there's a question of whether the structure that the subject grasps in their perception is sort of an accurate or correct representation of the structure of the object that is supposed to be grasped. And so here we're evaluating the perceptual capacity of a human subject, not in terms of whether it contributes to the success of the human lineage, but instead in terms of whether it grasps the signification or the structure of the situation correctly. So it's a completely different way of sort of treating a capacity to respond to a situation compared to the lion recognizing antelopes. So Bat has put in the chat here about how it's interesting to consider how difficult it must be for this capacity to develop through evolution. Yeah, this is something that a few different authors have talked about, how in some sense, for this kind of symbolic capacity to develop, you have to sort of not be good enough, or not be as like, or let me put this a different way. So the animal capacities in this immovable form of behavior involve this very sophisticated adaptation to an environment where you can detect all these subtle signals of, like, the smell of prey, for example, or this sort of rustling of the leaves means that there's a predator nearby or whatever. These very subtle responses to all these pieces of information coming from the environment. And to be able to perform this kind of symbolic grasp of the environment, you have to sort of separate yourself from that very direct, very subtle engagement with the environment. You have to sort of, I think I might have talked about this in an earlier session, but like something like being able to recognize the letter A, for example. You can, like, anyone who can read, like a sort of normal adult reader can read the letter A in a variety of different fonts. Capital or small, handwritten or typed. Even upside down is a little bit difficult, but you can normally still recognize it, etc. So you're responding not to like a particular pattern of stimulation, but to some sort of structure that the letter A is distinguished from all the other letters, and that's what makes it the letter A, even if there's nothing sort of geometrically in common that all these different letters that are all the letter A have, that they all share, whether handwritten or typed or whatever. So yeah, you have to sort of abstract from this very subtle response to the different qualities of the environment, and then sort of be able to treat everything that has a certain place in a structure as the letter A, no matter what exactly its shape or other properties might be. So it requires sort of separating yourself from that very very engaged encounter with aspects of the world, and sort of like taking some element of the world to be just a sort of point in a structure, as opposed to this like dynamic flow of information like it is for other animals. And there's an interesting case of there's a famous chimpanzee named Kanzi who so there were these experiments I think in the 80s. There were a few different like research groups that were doing this kind of thing, where they tried to teach sign language to, I think, gorillas and chimpanzees. And so the question is, like, can other apes learn language? That was sort of like the broader question. but there's in terms of like the articulatory movements, the shape of the mouth of other apes is quite different than humans, and their tongue and so on is much less capable of the sort of flexible movements that we make when we speak. So just at the sort of anatomical level, there's a sort of obstacle there. So to get around this anatomical obstacle, the idea was you would try to see if they could learn sign language, because of course chimpanzees and gorillas have hands that are quite similar to human hands in terms of like their capacity to move in various ways and flexible responses and so on. So they essentially tried to teach chimpanzees sign language, and the adult chimpanzees were capable of learning like sort of basic associations between like banana corresponds to this movement, and I don't know, water corresponds to this movement or whatever. But they never really learned anything like syntax or like how to combine signs together. But in one of the experiments, there was a mother with her infant, and so the mother was sort of being trained. What was like the main subject was being trained to use sign language, and then the infant, the one that's named Kanzi, was just sort of there and like not really part of the experiment, but was just clinging on to his mother. But then at some point, I don't remember exactly how, but the researchers figured out that Kanzi had been learning sign language while his mother was supposed to be trained, and Kanzi was capable of much more sophisticated sort of syntactic combinations of signs. So you could say something, you could like give signs to Kanzi saying like put the banana on the telephone or something, some like absurd sequence of signs that he had never seen before, and then he would respond by doing the action that corresponds to that sequence. So he was not just responding that this sign corresponds to this object, but he was like grasping the syntactic combination of the signs. So one, or like some people who have studied this case have suggested that part of what allowed for Kanzi to grasp the symbolic nature of the signs as opposed to just sort of an empirical association was precisely the fact that he was an infant, and so he didn't have this sort of sophisticated grasp of this very engaged and dynamic response to different elements of the environment that his mother had as an adult. So as an adult, she was had learned over her lifetime to respond to the way a tree branch swings and all these sort of very subtle and shifting cues that the environment presents, and was essentially just treating the signs that the experimenters were presenting to her as like another kind of environmental cue that if I present this sign, then I get a banana, more or less. Whereas Kanzi, because he had not learned all these sort of subtle dynamic cues of the environment, was capable of grasping the signs as symbolic and as having this sort of structural relationship to each other that we recognize as syntax. And this is especially interesting because humans are, I think we talked about this in the Simondon reading, are neotenous, meaning that humans. So if you look at the relationship between body mass, adult body mass, and gestation period, there's a pretty close linear relationship among mammals. So the bigger the mammal is, the longer their gestation period is. But humans are actually quite a bit below the trend line. So if you sort of extrapolate from the body mass of an adult human compared to the gestation period of other mammals, the gestation period should be closer to 18 months than 9 months. So humans are, in a sense, born early compared to other mammals. And so the suggestion is that this fact that humans are sort of born less mature than other mammals, and we know, of course, humans have a long period of immaturity. They're essentially helpless for the first couple years of their lives. This would sort of be part of what makes it possible for humans to learn this symbolic structure of language and all the other sort of symbolic structures that are characteristic of human societies. That it's the fact that we are born early and essentially helpless, and we have to sort of passively absorb the symbolic behavior of our parents and other humans around us, that sort of makes possible human language and symbolic cognition in general. Yeah, Angus has pointed out in the chat here that Kanzi is actually still alive. I didn't know that. That's interesting. So he was born in 1980, so he's 44 years old now, or not quite. He'll be 44 this year. Yeah, I don't know actually how long chimpanzees live. Yeah, we should we should all travel to Japan or wherever he lives now and see if we can hang out with him and talk about bananas. But yeah. So this, like, obviously there's many different interpretations of what exactly the Kanzi case sort of demonstrates, and the link with human neoteny is also controversial. So like these are not sort of universally accepted ideas, but it is very interesting to think of the human capacity for symbolic cognition as having to do with sort of an absence of this engagement with the world that is characteristic of other animals. So like the way that the infant is not yet capable of sort of not yet capable of sophisticated grasp of the perceptual cues in the environment and so on. I think that's a pretty interesting perspective on symbolic cognition and how it might arise out of the other types of capacity that we find in other animals. Right. Okay. Yes, we can go on to page 123 if someone else would like to read from the top.
Yeah, I can read, if you can hear me.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, great. The preceding descriptions permit us to situate the condition reflex in its true place, since vital behavior is attached to syncretic wholes, and since it is only at the level of symbolic behavior that we encounter an activity regulated by objective stimuli, such as those which are defined by physics. The condition reflex is either a pathological phenomenon or a higher mode of behavior. We have had occasion to call attention in dogs submitted to conditioning experiments to the appearance of eczema and even of genuine experimental neurosis. Pavlov speaks of a dog which after some time refused any new experience. The longer the session was prolonged, the more excited it became. It wanted to get loose, scratch the floor, gnaw the bench, etc. Dyspnoia, I don't know how you pronounce it. I'm just going to say dyspnoia. And a continuous salivation resulted from this uninterrupted muscular work. The animal became completely unsuitable for our work. Pavlov interprets this conduct as a freedom reflex, quote unquote. But the word, quote unquote, reflex has no meaning if it does not designate a specific reaction to a certain determined excitant. The reaction in question, however, is an indeterminate refusal to respond to stimuli. The general inhibition which is presented to us is not constructed according to the mechanical laws of conditioning. It expresses a law of a new kind, the orientation of the organism toward modes of behavior which have a biological meaning, towards natural situations, that is, an a priori of the organism. Thus, there is a norm inscribed in the facts themselves. Inasmuch as it is a phenomenon of disintegration, we will not be surprised to find the condition reflex more often and more easily, quote unquote, in children than in adults, in younger children than in older ones, and at an equal age, in the retarded rather than in the normal, unquote. But if the practice of reflex conditioning involves a pathological alteration, it is also because reacting to absolute stimuli is a difficult operation which the animal cannot execute for very long. We have seen that in the reactions of domestic chickens to colors, absolute choices were produced, but the adaptation to an absolute chromatic value is not stable. On the other hand, an adult man submitted to analogous experiments would hesitate on the principle of choice. Only in the instance in which the three nuances of gray were very close would he choose according to the relations of one to the other. In fact, one observes that reactions to absolute stimuli become more frequent as older children are tested. Finally, it is known that, in general, conditioned reflexes are all the more perfect as the cerebral development of the species considered is more advanced. We have said that trained subjects cannot designate letters separately on the keyboard of a machine. They succeed indirectly by cross-checking with a few of the motor structures which they are capable of executing and which the same letters form a part. This operation of the second power, this reaction to reactions, presupposes the structures which it analyzes. We see how the reference to absolute stimuli can have two meanings. It represents either a pathological disassociation or a new type of organization which, without destroying the existing structures, disposes them according to different perspectives. It is clear that it is not the explanatory principle of behavior in its first meaning. Okay, I'm gonna finish this section. But it is no more but it is no more so in the second meaning. At the same time that one delineates the originality of the higher structures, one establishes that they do not account for the others. At the same time that he was maintaining a psychological empiricism, Pavlov was borrowing his postulates from intellectualism. Empiricism and intellectualism carry over in primitive modes of behavior structures which belong to a very high level. Structure of pure juxtaposition, the atom, or structure of pure interiority, the relation. It will be maintained perhaps that, in refusing to construct behavior on the basis of these notions, which are constitutive of what we understand by nature, in rejecting them as anthropomorphic, we are implicitly referring to some reality in itself, en soi, to some hund from which intelligence emerges and with relation to which it can be called superficial. But this same reality, it will be added, can neither be named nor conceptualized except by the intellect. We will have to distinguish intellect and intellectualism, and perhaps to acknowledge the existence of significations which are not of the logical order. Here, it can be only a question of a preliminary description, which does not resolve the transcendental problems of open quotes, confused thought, end quotes, but which contributes to posing them. Okay, I think I got a bit lost at the very end, but the beginning part I sort of understand, I think. But I am a bit confused by the time that he talks about the two meanings. As far as I understand it, I think he's basically talking about how you have on one hand the reactions of reaction, the people who have been trained to I guess, type on a keyboard, being able to reflect on their reflexes and after the fact, I guess, select which or separate which motor structures they need to separate to be able to designate the letters separately, right? And the idea, as far as I understand it, is that this reference to stimuli is not really, or it's, I guess, above what Pavlov was capable of explaining his theories. But I'll let you maybe expand on that because I get a bit lost after that.
Yeah, I think so to go back to the beginning of that section, I think what he wants to suggest here is that the sort of patterns that are exhibited in the stimulus response experiments, the conditioned reflex experiments, are either pathological phenomena among animals or they're like these sophisticated responses among humans, but they are never sort of correspond to the they never make up the sort of components of normal behavior of animals in the way that the reflex theorists thought they would, or suppose that they would. So, for example, he gives the example that he takes from Pavlov of the dog that in this experimental setting essentially just gets confused and anxious and just sort of starts scratching the floor and trying to get out essentially. And so this is clearly not just the dog just says I would prefer not to. This dog is clearly not responding to some stimulus with a certain response. So like Pavlov describes it as the freedom reflex, but that's pretty obviously just like applying the word reflex to a behavior just because that's what you need for your system to work. The dog is not responding to a certain stimulus with a certain kind of response. It's sort of presented with a situation that it doesn't understand and trying to escape. It's like doing something that has a meaning, a biological significance, as opposed to sort of being conditioned to perform a certain response in a certain situation. There are instances where you can, through training, you can get chickens to, press the lever with the red label versus the green one or whatever. You can sort of bring about a conditioned response in an animal, but it turns out that it's pretty difficult. It's pretty difficult to bring about this kind of response. You have to give them sometimes like multiple hundreds of trials before they actually sort of reliably produce the response that you want. And then second, it's not very the response is not very stable in the sense that as you sort of vary the conditions, the animals respond in sort of arbitrary ways, or like it's hard to predict if you sort of train the animals to respond to, say, a lighter and a darker color of the label on the buttons, and then you present them with a different set of labels that they've never seen before. It's hard to tell what their response will be just based on what they've done in the previous trials. So the response is not very stable in the sense that it doesn't sort of extend to other situations in a predictable way. But then on the other hand, with humans, it's relatively easy to say, to train humans to press the green button as opposed to the red one or whatever. Like, it doesn't take many trials for a human to figure out, if I press the green button, I get a piece of chocolate. If I press the red one, I get an electric shock. You don't have to be like a genius of deductive power to figure that one out. And then if you switch up the experiment to some other design with green and red, then most people will sort of pretty quickly figure out that the green is still the one that gives you the chocolate or whatever. So like this response to a sort of absolute property of an object, just the green color or whatever it is, as opposed to like a sort of general perception of an environmental situation that can adapt to changes in the environment. This is characteristic of human responses and not of other animals. So it's it's because we as humans have a word green and various practices where recognizing the color green is important. Traffic lights or whatever. So we're like trained from childhood to understand that this kind of color belongs together in one category, and this is what we call green. That is what sort of allows us to adapt our behavior or to respond to the experimental situation by figuring out the rule. The green lever or the green button or whatever is the one that gives me chocolate, whereas the animal is just sort of responding to every element of the environment, and as the situation changes, it might have to relearn the pattern again, or it doesn't have this sort of capacity or trained response to recognize things as green in the way that we do. These reflexes that do appear in the training situation among animals are generally this sort of pathological response. And then there's the more sort of sophisticated response mediated by a symbolic cognition, by the possession of a concept of green or mastery of the word green that we find with humans. But there's like something in the middle that's missing that you would need for the reflex theory to be workable. So what he sort of points out in the next bit here is that the human capacity to sort of recognize these properties of objects is sort of brought about by this reflective capacity or reflexive capacity of humans to not just respond to a situation, but to sort of respond to our own responses. So if you, like his example is the keyboard, so if someone asked you where the letter Z is on a keyboard, most of us, I think, would not really be able to say just sort of off the top of our heads. But if you were like really pressed to answer this question correctly, you would probably like sort of type out a word in your head, like even in the air, in front of you, you would sort of like go through the motion of typing a word that contains the letter Z, and you would try to figure out which key you were pressing. And so this is a sort of decomposition of behavior into elements that you can perform at a more sort of sophisticated intellectual level, as opposed to sort of taking these elements to be the original sort of pieces of behavior that are put together, like the behaviorist or reflex theory supposed. And then the last bit here, he's just sort of pointing towards a problem that he's going to address more later on, but it's the question of if we acknowledge that animals and humans as well respond to they aren't responding to these physical properties of objects, a certain degree of illumination or temperature or whatever. If instead we acknowledge that the sort of more immediate relationship of animals, including humans, to the world around them is this the type of behavior that we see in the amovable forms, this kind of sophisticated dynamic engagement with objects, then the question is like, where did these, where does the engagement with the object sort of come from? I guess is maybe one way of putting it. It's hard to express this in a comprehensible way, but like, it's not the case that we can just do whatever we want with this dynamic engagement. Like, an animal that is trying to catch a prey animal has to actually respond to the signals that it gets from the environment in an appropriate way. It has to follow the scent or the pattern of broken twigs on the ground or whatever. It has to actually respond to what is there in its environment. But if we take it that the environment is made up of physical properties of some kind, mass and electric charge and temperature and all these things, then it seems like we are sort of stuck with the idea that we still need to make like some sort of bridge between the physical properties that we take to make up the environment and the dynamic engagement with the environment that the animal exhibits. We have to sort of find a way of explaining in physical terms what it is that the animal is responding to when it chases down an antelope or whatever it is. But that seems to be impossible. There doesn't seem to be like a physical property of like the sign of an antelope. Like, you can't sort of explain what it is that a lion is responding to in physical terms. So that leaves us with the question of like, where does this engagement with the environment come from? And so he is just sort of suggesting here, he doesn't solve this problem, but he's suggesting that this has to do with the relationship between what we think of as confused thought and clear thought. So you can think of, you're trying to solve a problem, and you have, think of like school, you have a homework problem that you're trying to solve. At the outset, you have just sort of a vague idea of, what it is you're trying to do, what your goal is, and so on. And then as you work on the problem, if everything goes well, then you eventually reach a point where you go, okay, yeah, now I understand what I'm supposed to do. Now I know what, I have a clear grasp of the solution. And so the question is like, what is the relationship between that sort of vague, confused understanding you had at the outset and the clear grasp of the solution you have at the end? There's obviously some connection in the sense that the solution is the solution of this precise problem, but it doesn't seem to be the case that the solution is sort of contained in the problem at the outset either, because if it were, then you could just look at the problem and figure out what the solution was. So there's some sort of difficult relationship between the problem and the solution, like this sort of intrinsic connection, but it's not sort of just a containment relationship that would allow you to sort of read off the solution from the problem. And so this is again sort of, so when we study animal behavior, the behavior is a kind of problem in the sense that we can grasp it in this sort of confused way. But then if we want to explain the behavior, we have to do it in intellectual terms. We have to sort of give a conceptual description or a symbolic description of the animal's behavior in terms of what aspects of the environment it's responding to and so on. But yeah, it's there's some connection between our intellectualized linguistic expression of the animal's capacity and the sort of confused grasp of the animal's capacity, but we have to figure out what that relationship is between the two, and that hasn't been done yet.
I think Merleau Ponty talked about intellectualism. I can't remember if it was in the preface or the introduction, something we read very early on. And there, I think he was using to refer to, I think, Kant and maybe a certain kind of phenomenology, a certain phase of Husserlian phenomenology, where there's this kind of pure self-transparency of the subject to itself. Do you think that is related to his point about intellectualism here?
Yeah, I don't remember which passage specifically you might be referring to, but generally when he talks about intellectualism, he is thinking of a sort of Kantian or neo-Kantian position, and so the idea, sort of the general orientation of this sort of school of thought would be that we have to grasp mental life or psychology in general in terms of judgments of like in perception we are sort of grasping, we're like performing the judgment that the apple is on the table, for example, and like what we have to analyze when we sort of study mental life is like the structures of the mind that enable these kinds of judgments to happen. And so like for Kant, of course, there's like the structures of space and time, and then there's the table of categories, and somehow these things sort of interact with each other to bring about what we know as empirical cognition. And of course, there's like various different ways of figuring out what these structures might be. But yeah, in general, it's this idea that our mental life is made up of judgments, and this is like the sort of basic action of the mind is to judge. We can connect this, like he mentions, I think at one point in this book, Helmholtz, who introduced this concept of unconscious inferences. So like the idea is that like when you see a car in the distance, the image on your retina is small, and then you sort of infer that if a car looks small, therefore it must be far away. So you're performing this, and of course this is not something that you're like consciously aware of, but the idea is that you're unconsciously performing this inference, and then you're judging that the small car is far away. So that's sort of like how you would analyze a perceptual experience. Is like as a kind of judgment. You perform intellectual operations like inference. And that brings about a judgment that the car is far away.
That's interesting. It makes me think of the conversation we had before we started recording about Dreyfus and McDowell. I think McDowell would be, the way I understand McDowell is basically Kantian, in that he thinks that all sensation is sort of conceptually structured in a way that sounds similar to what you just said about Helmholtz, whereas Dreyfus would dispute that.
Yeah, I'm sure McDowell's account is much more sophisticated than Helmholtz in terms of the understanding of perception has obviously advanced a lot in the last 100+ years, and sort of the philosophical grasp of how perception would relate to other aspects of mental life is quite different, and so on. I think that's probably correct. I think the McDowell approach to perception probably fits into this Kantian intellectualist tradition. So I'm gonna suggest that we stop here since we're sort of getting close to the time and we're at a section break. Also, I'm hungry. So we can. I think next time we should get through the conclusion is about 4 or 5 pages. We can get through that and finish the chapter next time.
That sounds good.
Okay. So thanks everyone, and hope to see you next week.